This is the story of the 2012 Norwegian Air Force C-130 crash. The C-130 is one of the world's most popular military airplanes ever. The C-130 has been in production since the 1954, and with over 2,500 planes made to date, it is safe to say that militaries around the world love the plane. The plane is featured heavily in the air forces of the US, UK, Canada, India, Pakistan, and as we'll see, Norway. The C-130 is so robust that one has landed and taken off from an American supercarrier without using the arrestor wire or the catapult. Something even more insane is the fact that the US Air Force modified a C-130 so that it could land in a sports stadium during the Iranian hostage crisis. To call this plane versatile would be an understatement. On the 15th of March 2012, a Norwegian Air Force C-130 would be flying from Harstad Airport or Evenes in Norway to Kiruna Airport in Sweden. The flight was part of a Norwegian military exercise called Cold Response. Their call sign for today was Haze-01, and that's how we're going to be referring to the flight. Today they were flying a transport flight. Their mission was to fly to Kiruna and pick up Norwegian personnel and fly them back to Norway. Once airborne, they were to go into a holding pattern as they waited for a German Transall C-160 to join them. Another Norwegian C-130 with the call sign Haze-02 would be meeting them at Kiruna. At 1:40 p.m., Haze-01 took off with 2 pilots, 2 loadmasters, and 1 passenger. The plane was 45 nautical miles from Evenes when it entered into a holding pattern. The plane was in the holding pattern for about an hour as they waited for the German plane. The German plane had the call sign Torch 3. Soon afterward, at 1:54 p.m., contact with Torch 3 was established. As they flew on, the pilots configured the plane for tactical combat operations. The commander stated, "Toss void." As they flew on, they talked about the flight back, talking about altitudes to be used and things like that. The crew set the radar altimeters to the same source. As they were trying to contact Torch 3, they got an error. IFF-2 was malfunctioning. IFF, or Identification Friend or Foe, is a radar system that is used to identify if a particular plane is a friendly or a hostile. At 2:24 p.m., the loadmaster asked about the TOS system. He asked, "Why does it say TOS Tactical Void there?" The crew tells the loadmaster that the TOS, or the Terrain Awareness Warning System, was not enabled as they were flying so high. Torch 3 radios in and lets the crew know that they're headed straight for the waypoint Vegas. Torch 3 lets the crew know that if they make contact with the troops on the ground, they'd relay information to the crew. The crew of Haze-1 were trying to get a hold of the troops on the ground at Kiruna. They've made several attempts, but so far nothing was getting through. At 2:44 p.m., the co-pilot and the commander were talking about the terrain of the area. The co-pilot asks, "Is it right that the elevation of the mountains up here is 7,000 feet?" The captain replies, 6,600, something like that. The first officer lets ATC know that they're ready to descend. Meanwhile, Torch 3 had made contact with the ground troops. They asked Haze-1 to leave the holding pattern and to head towards Kiruna. Bodo Control cleared Haze-1 to the VOR Kilo Romeo Alpha. Bodo Control, that is the Norwegian ATC, handed the plane over to Swedish Control. The radar service was terminated and handoff to Sweden was acknowledged by the commander. The commander made his presence known to the Swedish controllers. They acknowledged and let the crew know that they weren't on their radar scopes just yet. They went over the approach that they were about to make. They would fly towards the Kilo Romeo Alpha VOR and then they'd intercept the Vegas standard arrival route. At the end of this, the plane would be down to 10,000 feet. They were about to do what's known as a tactical approach. You don't see this at all in commercial aviation, but a tactical approach is designed to avoid hostile fire from enemy forces nearby your landing zone. In tactical approaches, you come in high and then you descend really quickly and slam on the brakes when you're on the ground. If you have surface-to-air missiles in the area, you can conduct a corkscrew landing to confuse the missiles. At 2:54 p.m., Swedish Control cleared the plane down to 10,000 feet and asked them to contact Kiruna Tower. Haze-01 let Kiruna Tower know that they were 15 nautical miles out. Kiruna Tower asked the plane to descend to 7,000 feet. As the plane descended, neither Norway nor Sweden had the plane on their respective radar scopes. At 2:57 p.m., the plane leveled off at 7,000 feet. At 7,000 feet, the plane was experiencing a bit of icing and a bit of turbulence. The pilots were slowing the plane down for the approach. At 2:57 p.m., as the autopilot was disconnected, a synthetic voice said "autopilot," indicating that the autopilot was now disconnected. At 2:58 p.m., the following transmission was made by Kiruna Tower. And Haze 01, descend altitude 5,000 feet, QNH 1000, T level 65. They got no reply. They tried again. Haze 01, Kiruna Tower. Still nothing. Unknown to them, Haze 01 had crashed into the west side of Mount Kebnekaise. None of the 5 people on board had survived. Once the crash site had been found, the investigators had to figure out how a military transport with way more tech than a civilian airliner crashed into the tallest mountain in Sweden. They had conducted interviews with other pilots in the Norwegian Air Force. They tell them that they usually flew in the area and knew about Mount Kebnekaise. To fly safely, the Norwegian pilots usually added about 2,000 feet of clearance between them and the mountain. This means that they flew at about 8,900 feet in the vicinity of Mount Kebnekaise. The investigators sift through the CVR trying to figure out this mystery. Takeoff was normal and the climb out was normal as well. The crew was conducting themselves as they should. They followed procedures to the letter. As they entered the holding pattern, they listened as the crew discussed their map scales, their flight back, and then the loadmaster brought up the issue of the TOS. The loadmaster was asking why the TOS system was not working. The commander says, because we are so high. The TOS was in tactical mode, and it was not working in that mode. The TOS system on the C-130 has 2 parts. You have a downward-facing radar altimeter that constantly measured how far above the plane is from the ground, and you have a computer comparing the plane's location with a digital map of the area to see if there's high terrain that the crew needs to know of. But to everyone's shock, the TOS system in tactical mode had some glaring issues. In tactical mode, the TOS relies on high-resolution ground maps to check for terrain, but that map has no data above 60 degrees of latitude. This means that the computer could not check for terrain in the area in which they were flying. The pilots had been told of this in their training with the US Air Force, but the investigators were confused. They had no reason to be flying the plane in tactical mode, and the pilots were well aware of the fact that they'd lose TOS if they went into tactical mode. The investigators listened. They heard the pilots radio Kiruna about being 50 nautical miles away, which is when they heard this transmission from Kiruna ATC. Haze 01 cleared towards overhead, descend flight level 70 initially. And so they started their descent down from 10,000 feet. In retrospect, this sounds like a very bad idea. They've just been cleared down to 7,000 feet in the vicinity of Sweden's tallest mountain. As they flew on, the investigators noticed that the plane was flying into some icing weather. This meant one thing. They were flying into a cloud bank. Unknown to the crew, the cloud bank hid the peaks of Mount Kebnekaise. It would have been hard to make out the white mountain against the white clouds, and so the plane flew into that cloud bank for the last time, and it never came out. But questions still remained. Why did the crew not realize the dangers of descending down to 7,000 feet? The plane started descending way too soon. Had they started their descent a bit later, they might have missed the mountain entirely. As soon as they were at 7,000 feet, they were now below the minimum safe altitude for the area. They started the flight at 13,000 feet, and then they planned their return flight at 16,000 feet. So they've obviously gone over the maps for the area and the dangers of flying too low in the area. Speaking of the maps, the investigators go over the maps that the crew had used. The maps had very little information on the Swedish side of the border. The Norwegian side is full of altitudes and markings, but the Swedish side is relatively bare. They found charts from the wreckage, and the charts clearly indicated minimum safe altitudes of about 9,300 feet to about 10,300 feet. The airplane's moving map also showed a minimum safe altitude of about 7,200 feet. The crew did discuss Kebnekaise on the CVR, but they did not talk about it as a threat or a safety hazard to the flight. They talked about its position, that's it. Moreover, they just trusted ATC. ATC in this part is usually very reliable, so they trusted their ATC fully. Remember the maps that we talked about before, the ones that were recovered from the crash? Well, those maps don't show Mount Kebnekaise. It just shows the entire region as being mountainous. Had the mountains been more clearly marked with its altitudes given as well, then that might have been enough to draw attention to the mountain that was starting to loom in front of them. Now, let's talk about the controllers. The regulation at the time stated that you cannot assign a cruising altitude that is less than 500 feet to the lowest boundary of the control area. So if your lowest boundary is at 9,000 feet, you cannot assign an altitude between 9,000 and 9,500. Area Control Center Stockholm cleared the plane down to 10,000 feet. They should not have done this. In the area where the plane was flying, the lower boundary was at 12,500 feet, and the plane was cleared down to 10,000 feet because they thought that the lower boundary was at 9,500 feet. As the plane descended, they were entering uncontrolled airspace and no one knew it. Why did the controller get this so wrong? Well, apparently the controller was thinking of the altitude sectors for Kiruna and not for the area where the plane was flying. The person just got confused. With that, the plane gets handed off to Kiruna Tower. The controller at Kiruna Tower also does not realize that 9,500 is not the lower boundary. In most of Sweden, 9,500 is the lower boundary, but here it's 12,500. As far as the controller was concerned, the plane was still in controlled airspace and out of danger. During interviews, the controller said that they had a plane in the terminal control area at 5,000 feet. The orange ring is the terminal control area. With Haze 1 at 7,000 feet, the planes would be well separated. Prior to March of 2012, it was okay for controllers in Sweden to send a plane from controlled airspace into uncontrolled airspace and then back into controlled airspace as long as it shortened their flight time. But the pilots had to be explicitly told that they'd be leaving controlled airspace for a bit. And so when the controller asked Haze 1 to descend down to 7,000 feet, the controller meant for them to descend when they entered this orange ring. That is when they got back into controlled airspace. But due to the phraseology used, the pilots misunderstood the controller and started descending right away. In ATC phraseology, when you use the word descend, it means that the plane should start descending right away. Instead, the controller should have said, descend when ready. Back when the crew started their flight, they planned to fly the first half of it under IFR rules and the second half under VFR conditions. But as they flew on, they found out that the weather was just too bad for VFR, and so they never canceled their IFR plan. But the controller was under the impression that the plane was in VFR conditions. The weather was good at Kiruna. He or she may have assumed that the weather that Haze 1 was experiencing was similar. With the controller having no radar, they had no idea that the plane was in danger. As far as he or she was concerned, the plane was at 10,000 feet. But due to the misinterpretation of the message from ATC, the crew began to descend too soon. They should have started their descent when they got to the terminal control area, but unfortunately, they did it almost instantly, and that took them into the heart of Mount Kebnekaise. Had they not put the plane into tactical mode, the TAWs would have warned them and they would have made it. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. A big thank you to Casey Planespotting for letting me use his amazing footage on my videos. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I'll catch you guys next time. Stay safe, wash your hands.